We turn our attention now in Chapter 9 to technology management. What we had done in this section, Section 3, is really for purposes of discussion, separate the various issues and challenges that confront us when we try to manage ICT for development projects. So, in this chapter, we will be looking at issues relating to technology. One of the most significant developments is the rapid growth of telecommunications infrastructure in the Asia Pacific. In fact, more than 50% of the growth is taking place in terms of mobile phones, broadband telephony in Asia Pacific. And yes, it is true that some countries are more ahead than others. There is also, in terms of access to internet, an expansion of broadband connectivity. However, in many countries, the digital divide still exists, whether it is within countries, that is between urban and rural centers, or it is between those who have, that is the rich, and those who do not, that is the poor, even in urban locations. So, while there is a rapid growth of telecommunications infrastructure in the Asia Pacific, and while there is an expansion of broadband connectivity, we still do have a digital divide, and therefore, the choices of technology that we use in order to address ICTD projects are affected by both the very positive growth of telecom and the very negative digital divide that still exists. When we talk of the digital divide, we are essentially talking about access to technology. In this access to technology, we can invariably talk about the access in terms of a hierarchy. First of all, it is necessary, if you look at the bottom of this chart, to have access to financial resources that enable us to perhaps even purchase a small mobile phone. Once we have access to financial resources, we also need to have access to some education and to some ICT literacy or computing skills. Even if we have the money and we have the skills, the next level in an upward movement is access to electricity or power sources. Access to electricity and power sources is followed by, in an upward movement, access to a computing device. If you do not have access to a PC or a laptop or a tablet, it is difficult to be able to talk about using ICTs. Once we have access to a computing device, we need to have access to the internet. This means, in addition to having a computer, we need to have those devices such as modems and routers that will enable us to connect to the internet. Once we access the internet, we then have to search for the content, and we must have access to the content that we need. And in most instances, even if we can reach to the top of this hierarchy, access to localized content is hard to come back. So, the access hierarchy moves all the way up from the bottom, which is having the basic money to be able to access education, electricity, computers, the internet, and then the content and localized content, and it has to be seen as such. When we have addressed the issues of access, it is not merely a question of the access hierarchy, because while efforts may be made to provide broadband connectivity and telecommunication infrastructure, even within a home, reach of a telecom signal does not symbolize access to a mobile phone. So, while there may be reach, the signal may be weak, the mobile telephone may be in the pocket of the male head of household, thereby access is limited to other members of the family. Then we begin to look at various other forms of providing this access. We look at telecenters where people can go to access information, or we look at mobile phones. Again, each of these various forms of access has both its strengths and its limitations. We know that in every home, while there may be a television set, so while the home may own a television set, the person who controls the remote control invariably controls the channel that people may be watching. Therefore, there is a difference between ownership of the mobile phone and control of its use. Ownership of a computer in a home may not necessarily mean that all members of the household also own it and therefore control it. In addition, when we look at technology access, we have to address socio-cultural factors that, for instance, limit women in developing countries to access technology. These may relate to what we call illiteracy, low self-esteem, lack of mobility, the inability to move out of the home, lack of awareness as to where to get the information. In addition to these issues of socio-cultural factors, the individual technologies also have certain capabilities and limitations which we talked about in chapter 2 and which in turn influence issues of technology access. Under these conditions, we must then look at, when we are making choices of technology, in terms of what are the factors that determine access. We must look in terms of content, its timeliness and its relevance. We must look at the design in terms of packaging and functionality, and we must look at the technology in terms of how easy it is that people can use it once they have access. In making a choice of technology, we also have to look not just at what is the latest technology of the day, but also at issues of costs. For instance, in an ICT intervention, there is always a budget that is allotted. The budget allotted may or may not be enough, but we also have to look at the budget allotted and the manner in which it is distributed. For instance, if in a budget, a major amount of the money is allocated to salaries and buildings, then there will be very little in terms of actual project deliverables that we have to do. In any budget, one must look at what are known as fixed costs and direct costs. Fixed costs relate to salaries, overheads, costs of buildings, costs of office automation, costs of communication, etc., which exist all the time, versus direct costs, which are those engaged specifically in the development of content and in the choice of technology for delivery. When we look at development costs versus technology costs, which is what I spoke about just now, development costs of content are always much higher than technology costs. Therefore, if you do have a budget, look at it in terms of how it is distributed between fixed costs and direct costs, and in the direct costs between development costs and technology costs. A thumb rule is that development costs will invariably be at least 50% of direct costs, whereas technology, with things becoming cheaper by the day, may not cost as much. Okay. Therefore, look at technology costs in terms of the amount of money allocated against the manner of its distribution. Look at the amount of money allocated for fixed costs against direct costs. And within direct costs, look at the amount of money allocated for development of the content versus choice of technology. When you begin to look at all of these, you will begin to be able to frame your ICTD project and in terms of what is available and what can be done, and make it more realistic, more down to earth, more deliverable in terms of limitations than if we were to think big and then find that we do not have the money to achieve our goals. So, the points to remember in making technology issues is that access is the single most important determinant when addressing technology choices. The two factors that determine choice of delivery are access and timeliness. Other factors are ease of design and use. As with any other product development, ICTD development has both fixed and direct costs. Fixed or hidden costs are institutional and, generally speaking, consist of salaries and other regular expenses. Direct costs are those where there is a clear and visible expenditure for the development or production of the ICTD intervention. And one thumb rule we must remember is that development costs for ICTD interventions are high. So, in this practical exercise, we are asking you to help decide what is the technology choice for a group of senior citizens in your community. Based on the answers you receive from the questions you ask people, recommend a technology choice which is, generally speaking, low in cost, but which would be useful for them.